Hello, happy Thursday. Welcome to PCAP's Native Prairie Speaker Series. My name is Caitlin Morose, and I am the Stewardship Coordinator with Saskatchewan Prairie Conservation Action Plan, or PCAP. Today, Dr. Lisha Berzins from the University of Saskatchewan will be speaking about prairie pond abundance and breeding success of tree swallows. What can the birds tell us about retaining ponds in agro-ecosystems? Every month, PCAP asks someone to present either in the form of a webinar or an in-person talk in a Saskatchewan community on anything to do with native prairie conservation or species at risk. On December 18th, Andrew Jakes will be speaking about pronghorn at the northern edge of the range. Check out the PCAP website, www.pcap-sk.org, for more information about upcoming presentations. I would like to take a moment to note that financial support for today's webinar is provided by our gold sponsors, Crescent Point Energy, Sask Power, Sask Energy, and Wildlife Habitat Canada. Our supporting sponsor is Eco-Friendly Sask, as well as Environment and Climate Change Canada. In-kind support for today's webinar has been given by the University of Saskatchewan. A reminder to all of our listeners out there, if you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to type it into the question section of the webinar dashboard at any time during the presentation, and questions will be answered at the end of the webinar. Now, a bit about today's presenter. Dr. Lisha Berzins is a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Biology at the University of Saskatchewan. Her research focuses on how the abundance of prairie ponds and insect food supply influence the breeding success of an aerial insectivore, the tree swallow, using both long-term data collected at the St. Denis National Research Area and field experiments. She obtained her PhD in 2017 at the University of Northern British Columbia, where she examined factors influencing the mating and reproductive success of female tree swallows. She also obtained a Master's of Science at Trent University, where she examined how increased reproductive costs influence immune function of black guillemots breeding in the Canadian Arctic. So with that, I'd like to pass it over to Lisha.
All right, thank you very much for having me speak today. I'm going to be talking about some research that I've been doing for a little while, and I'm really excited to share it. Not sure what to do. Oh, there we go. Okay, so I'm going to try not to use I. I'm going to try to use we because this research was a lot of effort by a lot of people, and so I'd just like to make some acknowledgements up front. So first, my supervisors, Dr. Bob Clark and Christy Morrissey, and my research partners at Ducks Unlimited, Drs. David Howder and Jim DeVries, along with some other people that have helped along the way. And because I'm going to be working with long-term data, speaking about long-term data, I'd also like to thank all the students and volunteers that have collected the data over the years, because without them, these long-term studies are not possible. And then, of course, all the funding that has contributed to this. So I'm going to start off talking about species declines, and if you've been listening to the news lately, in the last couple of years, you'll know there's been a lot of media attention given to some of the reports saying that bird species are declining. So if you've seen any of the state of the world, the UK, Canada, and North America, we're currently facing declines of many avian species, and some of the steepest declines are occurring for shorebirds, grassland species, and aerial insectivores. And some of these species that are having the steepest declines are those that are associated with farmland. So in these two figures, you can see farmland birds in the United Kingdom and in North America. And since about the 1970s, species associated with farmland have been declining. And so one of the mechanisms that's been proposed to account for these declines is agricultural intensification. And so this is where farming practices have gone from small scale to large scale intensive cropping. And so we have continuous cropping of monocultures. We've got increased cropping area into semi-natural habitats such as field margins and hedgerows. And we also have increased agrochemical use to produce crops. And so there's a number of different ways by which agricultural intensification can affect bird populations. So it can either affect populations directly, so through the loss of habitat, or pesticide toxicity, which can affect either the reproduction or survival of birds. But there's also a number of ways that agricultural intensification can affect birds indirectly. So it can indirectly affect food supply and it can cause or reduce food supply and habitat alteration, and also pesticide toxicity. And this can affect the physiology of birds. It can affect their condition and their quality. It can affect how they care for their young and how they forage themselves. And then these can have downstream effects on the number of offspring or babies that are produced in every year, and also the survival of the adults. And so when we have negative effects on reproduction and survival, that's when we can have populations of species declining. And with concerns over species declines in agricultural areas, there's been efforts to restore some of these semi-natural landscapes or features back into farmland. And so some of the ways that this can be done is by planting vegetation such as hedgerows and woodland islands, and also roadsides. So if you look at the bottom figure, this is just an example of an agri-environmental scheme from the UK showing the planting of some native vegetation back into the farmland. And some of this has been going on for quite a while, and they've been noticing, at least in the UK, that farmland bird species, they're still not recovering. And one of the things that's been called to attention is that ponds aren't really considered in some of these restoration efforts. And I know that there's organizations here in Canada that are considering ponds, but they are still being drained. And before I go any further, I should probably mention that when I say pond, I'm referring to a wetland basin that's flooded with water. And so we've had a global loss of ponds in agricultural areas. And so I'm just going to go through some examples quickly on some of the ways that we lost ponds. So ponds can either be filled. So the figure on the left shows where there are these ghost ponds. So they're ghosts because they were filled starting in this example between the 1800s and 1949. And so there's actually 19 ponds in this figure, but there's only 2 remaining. So the rest have been filled. And there's actually been some efforts now to go and dig up the ground and retrieve these ponds. And it's actually, if you look in the news, getting a lot of media attention because we're trying to bring these ponds back to life. And then ponds can also become terrestrialized. And so this is if we just leave ponds alone and they overgrow. They change in composition, so they don't really have aquatic vegetation and whatnot, and they're not as productive as if they've been managed. We've also built drainage ditches and drained ponds and water from the landscape. And sometimes we then consolidate ponds into larger water bodies. So the figure on the right is showing ponds in blue. And then in 1968 and then in 2005, you can see red, which are drainage ditches draining the water, and then larger areas where the water's been consolidated. And so the problem with this, though, is that these ponds, when they're lost and degraded, may not produce aquatic insects. And so if we let them get overgrown, as in the top example, they may produce, or they've been shown to produce, fewer aquatic insects than when they're managed and open. And here in the prairies, intact ponds and crop fields likely produce more aquatic insects than ones that have been filled in. And so aquatic insects that emerge from intact ponds are valuable for terrestrial systems. Studies have shown that these aquatic insects they're more nutritious because they contain higher levels of fatty acids than terrestrial insects, and that supports the reproduction and survival of birds. So when they have access to aquatic insects, they grow faster, they're more likely to fledge. And so in North America, we have the Prairie pothole region. So this is an area that's in the middle of North America, and it's an area that's rich in ponds, and it has grasslands. It has a lot of biodiversity, but it also contains a number of threatened and endangered species. And it's very productive for birds. So for instance, it's called the duck factory because 50% of waterfowl in North America breed in the Prairie pothole region. It's also really productive though for agriculture. So 1/3 of North America's grains, legumes, and canola come from the Prairie pothole region. And so a lot of grassland has been converted into cropland, and because of this, we've lost 90% of our natural grassland. And in addition, we've drained 70% of our ponds. And so for my research, what we wanted to know is if retaining ponds in intensive croplands can offset the negative effects of agricultural intensification on birds. And so to do this, we wanted to use data to examine how ponds affect the breeding success and quality of tree swallows, and we had two approaches. The first one was to use long-term data, where we have data for fluctuations of pond abundance during cycles of wet and dry years. And then we also did a 2-year field study where we have nest boxes across a gradient of pond abundances from drained to retained. And I'm just briefly going to go through the life cycle of swallows, just so you know what happens and the types of data that we can get from studying swallows. So swallows arrive to the study area in late April, and then in mid-May to early June, the insects emerge from ponds and then the birds start laying their eggs. In mid to late June, the eggs hatch, the nestlings start growing, and then early to mid-July, they fledge from the nest and there's fledglings flying in the sky. And so what we can get are estimates of the number of eggs laid, so their clutch size. We can measure the nestlings on day 12, and we can get their pre-fledgling quality, so we can get mass and growth, structural size. We can look at how many fledglings fledge from each nest, and then of the fledglings that are produced and the adults that are around at the study area, we can get estimates of their survival when they come back the following year. Okay, so part one, the long-term data collected at St. Denis National Wildlife Area. So we've had nest box population going since the early 90s, and we have more than 100 nest boxes and nearly full occupancy in every single year. And there's between 2 to 100 ponds annually, depending on the weather conditions. And so we've been doing a mark for capture study since 1990. And so we go out every single year, we monitor all the nests, so all the eggs that are laid, the success of the nest. We capture all the adults on the study site when they're feeding their young. And then we also measure all of the nestlings on day 12. We measure the adults too. And we've also been sampling for aerial insects for 17 of the 28 years of the study. So as I mentioned, insects emerge from ponds, and then we have these passive samplers in the upland that capture aerial insects. Okay, so the first thing that we wanted to ask is what causes variation in nestling mass. And so we did this with a student, Andy Mazer, and the results from our top model, which are in the figure here. So this is the predicted nestling body mass from our model against an x-axis of either insect biomass, pond abundance, or temperature. And what you can see is a positive relationship between nestling body mass and insect biomass. There's also a positive relationship between nestling body mass and the abundance of ponds, and as well a positive relationship between nestling body mass and temperature. And so what this is telling us is that nestlings are heavier when ponds are abundant, when temperatures are warm, and insects are plentiful. And interestingly, the effects are independent of one another, and ponds had a larger effect than did insects. And so there's a couple of things that might be going on to explain this. The first could be that these passive samplers don't capture the full range of insects that are available to swallows, but these have been being used for decades and decades, and estimates of total biomass that we receive from these have been linked to various reproductive indices. So it is alternatively possible that because we're using total biomass in these estimates and we haven't separated things into aquatic insects versus terrestrial insects, that ponds might be measuring an unmeasured component being the aquatic insects, or there could be something else in the environment that ponds are telling us that the insects just aren't. So then you could ask though, do ponds provide more nutritious insects to nestlings? And while we can't do this with the long-term data, a master's student that recently finished, Andrew Algan, he looked at this for nestlings that were raised in cropped and grassland sites. And so in the figure, the y-axis is nestling body mass, and on the x-axis is an APA-ARA ratio. And this ratio is an omega-3 long-chain fatty acid proxy. And so there's a positive relationship between nestling body mass and this fatty acid proxy, which suggests that nestlings that are heavier have more of this have more fatty acids in their blood plasma. And so it is possible that ponds then are providing swallows with these nutritious aquatic insects. So in some places where tree swallows are declining in parts of their range, they're also reporting declines in body mass of adults and nestlings. And so the next thing we wanted to know is if the body mass of nestlings was declining. And if you look at the figure, so on the left we have the mean body mass of all the nestlings for each year, plotted against the year. And so body mass of nestlings is fluctuating, and it's higher now than it was in the early 90s, but it's not declining. And so if we look at the annual body mass of these nestlings in relation to what the pond counts were in May, so we have nestling body mass on the left, right, and May pond count on the left, and we have a positive correlation between the annual number of ponds and the annual body mass of nestlings. And so what this is telling us is that nestlings are heavier in years when ponds are abundant. And so then we were also interested in, well, are ponds related to the number of recruits that are produced? And so recruits are nestlings that fledge from the nest and come back in the following season. And so we have the annual number of recruits on the right-hand side, and again, the May pond count on the left. And again, we have a nice positive relationship between the number of May ponds and the number of recruits that's produced. And so this is telling us that in years when there's more ponds, more recruits are produced. And then the last piece that we wanted to know was, if you look at on an annual basis, is the number of recruits that's produced in a year related to the body mass of those nestlings. And again, we have a positive relationship between the mean annual body mass of nestlings on the y-axis and the annual number of recruits on the x-axis. And so collectively, what these data are showing us is that when there's more ponds, in years with more ponds, the nestlings are heavier and they produce more recruits. And so this is along the lines of the work that was done by Dr. Vanessa Harriman when she did her PhD here. And she looked at the survival probability of individual nestlings in relation to body mass and the Palmer Drought Severity Index. And the Palmer Drought Severity Index, it's an index of soil moisture conditions. And at our study site, it's positive related to the pond count. So it's a proxy for ponds. And so if you look at the y-axis, we have first year parent survival, and then on the bottom we have nestling body mass and the Palmer drought severity index. And you can see for both there is a positive relationship. So first year apparent survival of nestlings is greater when the nestlings are heavier, and also when soil moisture conditions are wetter. And this is especially so for birds that are hatched early in the season. And so here we can see positive effects of ponds on first year survival of nestlings. And then for adults, Dr. Bob Clark and colleagues, they were interested in what influences the survival of adult swallows. And so they were also found that ponds played an important role. So we have apparent survival on the y-axis and the previous spring count on the x-axis. So previous years ponds would be the ponds in the year that they bred, and then they returned. That's why it's previous. And so again, there's nice positive relationship. So when there's more ponds at the study site, birds are more likely to survive and come back. So I've also been working on the lifetime reproductive success of known age female tree swallows at our study site. And so known age females are the females that have either recruited back to the study site, so we know their age, or they're the females that we can age with certainty based on their color. And so we've been interested in whether individual characteristics of the swallows, so their quality, or environmental factors play a role in lifetime reproductive success, where lifetime reproductive success is measured as the number of recruits that a female produces over her lifetime. And so for this, we total the number of breeding attempts, eggs, fledglings over a female's lifetime. We know what her relative quality is and the relative environment. And so this looks a little complicated, but oh, and we did this with a path analysis. So a path analysis allows us to test the relative contribution of individual characteristics versus environmental all at the same time. And so what it shows is in yellow here we have individual characteristics. So individual characteristics of swallows is important for LRS, for lifetime reproductive success, but also the relative number of ponds plays a really big role. And so I'm just going to zoom in on ponds and just show you that when there's more ponds breeding in the year, when there's more ponds available, in the year that females breed, they lay more total eggs in their lifetime, they produce more total fledglings, and they produce more total recruits. So ponds has a really big effect on the lifetime reproductive success of female swallows. And so that was a lot of slides to go through. So I just want to sum up before I continue on what the long-term data has shown so far, and that it's shown that prairie ponds are important for survival and reproductive success of swallows. So ponds have a positive effect on the survival of adults, on the recruitment of offspring. It has a positive effect on the quality of offspring that are produced, and also influences their lifetime reproductive success. Okay, so for the second part, we've also conducted a field study to look at retaining ponds in intensely cropped agricultural landscapes. And so our research group has been doing work on tree swallows in areas that are intensely cropped versus grassland. And former student Chantel Michelson, who did her master's here, she was interested in the diet that swallows are eating between these cropland sites and the grassland sites. And so on the bottom axis here, we have food broken up into aquatic orders. So these would be insects that emerge from ponds. And then there's terrestrial flies and then terrestrial orders. And so what she found was that birds that are breeding in cropped areas also are relying on aquatic insects. So when there's ponds in these areas, birds are eating aquatic insects. And then Andrew Elgin, who recently finished his master's, he put these little miniaturized GPS units on swallows, and he's nicely shown that swallows do forage at ponds. And He also found that swallows are more selective to use ponds the further away from the nest box. So when swallows are feeding their offspring, if they're flying far away from the nest, they're more likely to use ponds than forage over cropped areas or non-cropped areas. So we did a field study where we set up nest boxes in intensively cropped agricultural areas along a gradient of pond abundances. And so the proportion of ponds was measured as the number of ponds in relation in a 50-meter radius. And we chose a 50-meter radius because 90% of swallows forage in this area when they're feeding their nestlings. And I guess I should note that we have 16 sites, and each site has 6 nest boxes. So we have a lot of boxes spread out over this wetland gradient. And so the first thing we wanted to know is if the occupancy of our nest boxes was related to the abundance of ponds. And so here in this figure on the y-axis, we have the proportion of occupied boxes and the proportion of ponds within 500 meters. And you can see both of these are cropped fields, intensively cropped fields. They just differ in their wetland abundance. And so what we found was that there's full occupancy at sites that have ponds, but at the sites that have fewer ponds, occupancy is lower, but it's also way more variable. And then we looked at the mass of nestlings that are raised across the gradient of ponds. And what we found, here we have the average nestlings by site. So we have 16 sites, so I took the average of all the nestlings at a site, and it's being plotted against the proportion of ponds. And in 2018, nestlings were generally lighter, but in 2019, there's a relationship between the nestling body mass and ponds. So in 2019, at least, nestlings raised at intensely cropped sites with higher pond abundance or heavier. And then when we looked at the number of fledged young across the pond gradient, we found that there was no difference in 2018, but there was a tendency for more young to be fledged from sites that had higher pond abundance in 2019. But collectively, these results are all suggesting that when there's ponds in intensively cropped sites, the birds tend to do better. So we just finished that field study, so there's still a lot of work that I'm doing. Right now, we're working to look at the abundance and biomass of aquatic versus terrestrial species using that we collected in 2018 using sweep samples, in 2019 using Malaise traps. And then we're also going to be examining whether the heavy body mass of nestlings that we've seen at sites with higher pond abundance is related to the nutritional quality of the insects that they're given. So we're going to be looking at fatty acid levels in their blood. So our overall conclusions are that ponds are important for the breeding success and survival of tree swallows in the prairies. And it's likely because aquatic insects that are emerging from these ponds are providing birds with nutritious food resources. And also the benefits of conserving ponds in agricultural landscapes, they extend to terrestrial species via aquatic resources. And so retaining ponds in agricultural landscapes is more than providing habitat. The export of aquatic subsidies to terrestrial systems is really important. And there's some recent literature also demonstrating this. So ponds in agricultural areas provide aquatic food sources to ducks that are migrating through the area. In the UK, ponds that are managed to be open canopy, they have a higher abundance and species richness of birds. And in this figure, they're showing that the birds are using these ponds and that they're actually nesting closer to the ponds that are productive. And then they also support beneficial insects. So when there's ponds in agricultural fields, there's pollinators of those ponds. And so if we continue to drain ponds in the prairies, we might be faced with a difficult situation where we have a collapse of terrestrial biota that are reliant on these aquatic systems. And so to bring this back to the question about what the birds are telling us about retaining ponds, I think the answer is that they're telling us that ponds are providing essential food resources to terrestrial species and that they're ultimately enhancing biodiversity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisha, and thanks for all of your hard work in answering that question. It really sheds light on the importance of prairie ponds for the ecosystem, so thank you. To all of our listeners out there, thanks so much for tuning in today. If you have any questions, please feel free to type it into the question section of the webinar dashboard. And Lisha, I know that you're also doing this presentation live on your end, so feel free to let me know if there's anyone that has any questions over there.
Okay.
Our first question from a listener, they would like to know how you became interested in tree swallows and birds in general.
Oh, well, I've always liked birds. I made a mobile of a mallard duck in grade 1, and I was kind of hooked since then. Swallows, I don't know. My first job was on swallows, and I guess I love them so much that I've stuck with them. They're a really great species because they're sensitive to environmental conditions and food conditions, and they readily breed in nest boxes. But yeah, I think that's the answer to that.
Thank you. A listener named Kathleen would like to know if she could get access to to your research, to a paper essentially.
Yeah, so right now I'm just writing up all the work. So I have manuscripts that are written that we're going to be submitted soon. So hopefully things will be published shortly. But if people want further information, they can contact me because we have written manuscripts that.
Okay, awesome. And you can also share it with me too, and I can put it on the PCAP social media as well and then let people know.
Yeah, so when they do come out, I can for sure share that the work has been published and share the PDF.
Okay, awesome. And I'll also let listeners know that this presentation is being recorded, so you're welcome to watch it on our YouTube channel if you missed something, or feel free to share the link, and that'll be posted later today or tomorrow. Anisha, there's a question from a listener named Anna, and she would like to know if you've done any work on species, like swallow species, that are not as riparian as tree swallows, and if you've found any difference.
No, my work is mostly focused on tree swallows, but I think that, you know, they also breed in agricultural areas, and I've seen them using ponds, so I think that the work is transferable.
Thank you for that answer. And Kathleen, again, would like to know if you have a good design for nesting boxes.
Yeah, so there's two different types of nesting boxes. And yeah, if she wants to email me, I could give her the designs. There's two typical ones that people use for swallows that are standard.
Okay, that is good to know.
Yeah, if she just wants to contact me, I could give all that information.
Okay, I will let Kathleen know that. There's a couple more questions coming in. I know, I guess we still have a bit of time. So a listener named Ryan would like to know, are there any thoughts on what the minimum proportion of ponds are needed in that 500-meter radius of the nest to ensure adequate reproduction?
I'm not sure what the minimum is. That might be something that I would want to figure out. Some of the study sites that are at the lower end, they have very, very few wetlands. And so I would say that the results that we're finding are suggesting that it's not enough and that we need more. But I'm not sure that would be something to definitely look into, like what the threshold level is, and I'm not entirely sure what that is, but when there are ponds around the nest boxes, those birds tend to do well.
Okay, thanks for that answer. A listener named Jeff would like to know if you've made any effort to quantify benefits to farmers of retaining wetlands.
No, I directly have not, but I know that there are programs that farmers can enroll in to try to get things, I think, like incentives or land easements for retaining ponds on their land. And that is something that we really all should be collectively working together to try to achieve. Yeah, so research like this really needs to be done, I think, with landowners, because a lot of these ponds are on their property, and you know, we kind of all need to work together, I think, to make the system better. And so I'm not directly working on it, but I do know that there, I think, are some programs where there are easements and incentives to farmers to keep wetlands on their property.
Yeah, I believe Ducks Unlimited Canada and Water Security Agency have a few different programs available. Those are just ones I can think of off the top of my head.
Yeah, I believe that they do as well.
Well, thanks for your answer. Does anyone have any questions on your end?
I can ask. Does anyone have any questions?
Well, I'll just point out, I'll make a comment that the University of Saskatchewan and Ducks Unlimited have a program of research where they're actually looking at beneficial insects associated with pond margins on these sites that you're studying, actually.
Right. So we just wanted, Dr. Bob Clark just wanted to make a note that the University of Saskatchewan and Ducks Unlimited on these sites have a research program looking at beneficial insects.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. That looks like all the questions that we have from our listeners. One listener named Gail wrote in that says, thank you very much for the excellent talk, and that she's a member of Nature Regina, and that you've given her a good idea for a kids and adults talk and building a nest box activity or installing nest boxes. So she says, thank you for the talk. And I guess with that, thanks so much. This was really informative, and thanks for all of your work that you're doing for tree swallows.
Thank you. And thank you for having me.
Thanks everyone for tuning in today, and feel free to check out the PCAP YouTube channel again for a recording of this, or a website for a list of upcoming presentations. So with that, have a great rest of your day, everyone.